Namaste and welcome to the Bharat Vartha podcast. Free trade agreements are the cornerstone for any strong economy, with India's policymaking and foreign policy shifting towards becoming the next manufacturing hub. FTAs are integral for our growth into the next global superpower. To discuss all of this and more, we have our guests Rahul Bajoria and Nirav Kanodra. Rahul is an economist focusing on Asia Pacific with a special emphasis on India's macroeconomy and policymaking. Hey Rahul, thanks for being on Bharat Vartha.
Hey, thanks for having me, Carrie.
Nirav is our regular guest on Bharat Vartha Weekly. He's an investment banker based out of Singapore with extensive experience in sales and trading. He's also a prominent voice when it comes to macroeconomic issues. Welcome back, Nirav.
Hey, thanks for having me, Carrie.
So Nirav and Rahul, thanks again for being on Bharat Vartha. We have a lot of interesting facets to cover. So maybe we'll begin with Nirav. What is the significance of FTAs? Why do you think they're necessary for a country?
Okay, so basically what happens is each country, when they trade with another country, earlier, if you go back in history, what was there was this was an opportunity for revenue to tax imports, right? And also, second thing is you wanted to protect your own industry, your own earlier bulk of the industrial agriculture, but you want to protect your own people. So that's why you taxed imports at a certain level, right? So now what does free trade agreement do is it reduces the level of tariffs for trade between the countries for a certain set of specified goods or services, right? So you go back like to the Coase theorem. The old the economist has said that, say for example, England produces more wool, Portugal produces more wine, and then trade between England and Portugal, though both can produce wool and wine together, it's better if England does more textiles and Portugal does more wine and they trade with each other. So countries where they have a competitive advantage. So this is like the classical theory, which is for more global free trade. Now, obviously, there are certain things where you have maybe like a very big manufacturer who could then seek monopoly seeking powers. Right? Say if somebody corners, you have a classic example of OPEC ganging together and doing that. So obviously, like free trade as it works in textbooks need not always happen, but a free trade agreement enables two countries to trade with each other more. If you go back earlier, India was kind of being a non-aligned country, was not in any of the active blocks, either with USSR or with USA. And India was very much a closed economy. So what had happened is that India kind of didn't trade too much. It was more of a closed, domestically focused economy that we consumed whatever we made on our own, right? So that was what it was in the era of license Raj, right? And as all economies have opened up, signing free trade agreements with various other countries gives us opportunity to use where we could have competitive strengths to export more and import things that we cannot make or we do not have a competitive edge in, which probably helps in maintaining inflation lower, right? One very good example, one very successful one on a massive scale is China. China was very much close to the rest of the world till like when Nixon visited Mao in the late 70s. And then in a slow process, by the year 2000, they joined the WTO and where they accepted. So here they kind of signed effectively free trade agreements with a lot of countries, which helped them become like the factory of the world, right? Because with a large labor population, they could have cheap labor and export manufactured goods. So yeah, this is what is the FTAs, like the significance. Now, if you look at India's history, what has happened is India probably earlier was not the best one to sign on FTAs where you had complementary skill sets. I gave the example of Coase theorem between, say, England and Portugal. That was the original one. But India had FTAs with Japan, South Korea, ASEAN countries, and like Singapore. So if you look at like Japan and South Korea, they're like big manufacturing hubs. And they're very big exporters of manufactured goods. India should have been one, but India with its cheap labor and like various other multiple industrial policies hasn't been able to be that good. And here what happened is this led to a little bit of deindustrialization of India. We did have like say Maruti Suzuki. So Suzuki set up a plant in India. You had Honda JV with Hero Cycle. So Hero Honda was set up. You had Hyundai and LG set up plants in India. Under those kind of free trade agreements, we asked them to like invest a bit in India. But actually what happened is on the whole, we saw a little bit of deindustrialization. Similar with ASEAN countries, say India imports a lot of edible oil from like Malaysia and Indonesia, while we could probably grow it in India itself, right? And the last one I want to talk about is Sika, which is with Singapore. Now, this is the type of country, though Singapore is a very small population, is where India should think of having FTAs with other countries which are big consumption economies, right? Like, so Singapore is a nice trading hub, but it has a little bit of deeper pockets. And India could say sell manufactured goods. So, for example, I give an example of this. In Singapore, not many people know it, but you can buy Bajaj or Royal Enfield motorcycles, right? And that is a bit popular amongst actually like a few of the workers or the construction workers, the delivery crew, right? So I think that is something where India has to be selective and now look at signing FTAs with countries where we have complementary trades where it can actually benefit India and leverage India's larger population and cheaper labor to sell manufactured goods and then import certain things that we don't have.
Right. So Rahul, there's been a shift in perspective, right? I think in the earlier days, India used FTAs more as a tool for diplomacy, but now we're seeing it as an integral part of, economic or trade policy as such. Can you talk us through that change and so on?
Yeah, sure. So I would, just to add to what Nirav also said, and he covered some of this already. I think FTAs, generally speaking, right, they have become a tool of foreign policy or trade policy, only from, I would say, around the 1970s, 1980s, right, is when they became some amount of legitimacy, mainly because before that, till about the Second World War, and, then we had a lot of decolonization, right? So in a way, trade was a way of, running your foreign policy, but there was more of a colonization angle to it rather than, necessarily being trading on equal terms. And so what that kind of replaced was the whole idea of, sort of moving towards having more specialization as far as your manufacturing and your services activity is concerned, but more from a, two sovereign nations kind of trading within themselves, and then them setting what will be the terms of trade, right? In terms of trade policy between them or between a larger group of nations, right? So FTAs in that sense have only been in vogue, I would say, for the last 20, 30 years. It's not necessarily been something, that's been emphasized upon for a long period, but it's more of, in the recent last 20, 30 years is when they have gained prominence as a legitimate or, as a very effective tool of growing your own economy. Now, in the context of India, right, and Nirav covered some of this, India has never been very, very good as far as, trading has been concerned, at least from a post-independent perspective, right? So if you look at the pre-independence era, India actually was one of the large exporters within the British Empire. We were running really large balance of payment surpluses, exporting all kinds of raw materials. And that, oftentimes was done under duress, where you had a lot of stress, like say Bengal famines, etc., being created out of a very lopsided trade policy. But then post independence, both because of our industrial policy constraints and because of, some of the, I guess, greater ideological, mindset of, being self-reliant or, being fairly import substituting in our industrial policy, we never really saw exports as a way to grow, right? Which was not the policy that was adopted by a large number of, say, East Asian economies like Korea, Taiwan, later on China. And so their manufacturing sectors naturally grew a lot faster than what India's manufacturing did, right? Now, post the liberalization period, as Nirav was saying, there was a change in industrial policy that came about for India. And as such, I would say the role of the state became a lot smaller in terms of driving external trade, and the role of the private sector grew. And so naturally, when you allow the private sector to find business opportunities, we did see a fair amount of, say, innovation, not just in manufacturing, but our entire IT and allied services, and now the ecosystem around startups, etc., has been designed, right, keeping exports in mind. And so a lot of this was, I would say, not necessarily because of state policy or statecraft, right? A lot of it happened in a fairly serendipitous manner and was led by, India's private sector. What has happened, though, I would say, as Nirav was saying, we have looked at FTAs as a tool of growth, in bouts and, like small bursts, right? So effectively, in the late 90s, early 2000s, when our trade was expanding, we thought that, we would add a bit more of a top-down, factor behind it through FTAs in East Asia. Then, as our economy started to stagnate, our manufacturing outlook was stagnating, and this is partly not in our hand. It was because global demand was stagnating. We became a little bit more protectionist because India was not necessarily gaining, market share in several areas that we were trying to be good at least from a trade policy. And now that in the last 2-3 years, India's external trade has been performing well. We have seen, some amount of move away from, say, concentrated supply chains, to a bit more distribution. India is sort of sensing an opportunity, and so we are going back. It's not necessarily, I would say, all driven because, there was a flip in the government mindset, that trade is good or trade is bad. It's also what the private sector is telling them, and what we are seeing from a geopolitical perspective is the reason why, we are now using or going back to an environment where we are welcoming free trade agreements because we genuinely feel we can benefit from it, right? If we had felt that we are not going to benefit from FTAs, we would not really be pushing hard to sign many of them. So I think it just sort of gives you a sense of where we are from a global perspective in the manufacturing process, and we look at it as a driving force for good rather than bad as far as our own economic structure is concerned at the moment.
Yeah, I saw an interesting tweet by Rajiv Mantri which said that Pakistan was more integrated with the world economy than India at some point. So Nirav, I mean, we do have preferential access, economic cooperation, some kind of FTAs with about 50 plus countries, right? And bilateral trade deals and so on and so forth. We're going back and renegotiating some of these, right? Can you talk about that element? I mean, what will the renegotiation entail?
Over here on the renegotiation part, right? India, historically, what has happened is we've had PTSD of the episode in the 60s where we had food shortages, right? Before the Green Revolution. And a lot of our policy has been that that time we had to import food, and so we, in any of our trade deals, we kind of put our foot down and said that okay, we cannot allow agri imports or dairy imports. Similar recent one which has been signed with Australia as well, right? So that did not allow us to get, like, because we blocked out some things, we did not get access to the other things, right? Second thing is India has had we've had a very big success in the IT services industry, where we could export a lot of our educated skilled labor who could work on the visas which were issued. So movement of people was another big issue, and then that is being seen. So now what has happened is the ones which are, say, if you compare India, say, versus China, Vietnam, or Bangladesh, right, or other Southeast Asian nations. So, for example, like China is open to importing a lot of food while they are okay to export manufactured goods, right? So there are certain of these kind of constraints which allow China to join WTO, or like, say, Vietnam or Bangladesh has a FTA with EU. This is what was one big constraint. Second thing is India, a lot of the earlier industrial policy was also in conjunction with our local, you had the Bombay Club, which actually called for more protectionism, right? Because they were like in a cozy club, they had a quasi-monopoly. Again, I'll give an example of Bajaj scooters. Because they had a easy monopoly, they could sell you'd not say substandard, but like a below par product and still make good profit. So they did not want any competition coming in, right? That was our earlier import substitution or protectionist policies. So then when we started after liberalization, which was under duress, a lot of these FTAs were signed under duress, when India had to take a bailout from IMF. And those ones probably did not serve India's interests the most. So now India has built up a little more capability. And second thing is, if we are in a globally connected world, so if you are making, say, for example, there's a big push on PLIs on semiconductor, or there's a big push on PLIs on pharmaceuticals, you have a lot of different components coming from different parts of the world. So the previous FTAs where they blocked off certain things, you had a lot of high tariffs on certain inputs, then you cannot be really competitive, right? So I think all of these things are being looked at again. We are renegotiating our FTAs, maybe Rahul can correct me, a lot with like the East Asian countries, right? And so that is one thing where probably if we expand the list of tradable goods, is something where we can then compete internationally on manufacturing something. So to make an iPhone, it has like multiple components. If we have like high tariffs on one of the components, then we cannot really assemble iPhones cheaply in India with using, like, even if it is at this moment, a lot of it is just screwdriver technology. A better trade agreements with everyone will allow us to get the inputs easier and then export it out to other countries where they put less tariffs on goods manufactured in India. So this is what is being done.
Can I come
Yeah,
in
go
on
ahead.
that?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So just to add to what Nirav said, I mean, one clarification: I don't think India signed any of the FTAs under any sort of a duress, right? I mean, it was more a choice on the policy side. But then he's right. Nirav is right to say that the renegotiation is being done because obviously something was not working, right, in those FTAs, or at least in some sense, I would say that we have had a fairly myopic approach as far as our own domestic industrial policy was concerned and what we gave away in those FTAs, right? So say something like as simple as mobile phone assembling, right? I mean, India actually had
Yeah.
higher duties on domestic manufacturing versus obviously a lot of it was coming in tariff free or duty free from outside. And so I wouldn't necessarily blame it on the FTA, right? I mean, the FTA did what it was supposed to do, but then it was our own policies were not corrected, right? We were running inverted duty structures, and so it was inefficient to manufacture anything in India, and it was far cheaper to get say an air conditioning unit from Thailand, or a solar panel from Malaysia, or get refined palm oil from Indonesia. So I think it is more a challenge on the domestic side. Obviously, some of these things, India's exports also faced some amount of constraint, in the sense that we have always been reasonably good or very quick in terms of implementing everything we agree to in an FTA as well, right? Whereas in a lot of other places, you might lower the tariff, but then there could be a lot of non-tariff ban, and we can talk about this. But in some sense, I think it is India's. These negotiations actually do have a periodic element to it. That every 10 years, a country retains the right to sort of look through whether something is working, something is not working. If it's not working, what can we do? So I think there is a periodic part to it, but then there's also a strategic part that we want to make sure that these FTAs, tend to lead to more balanced trade and not necessarily only provide one-way market access, which was, I think, the sense that a lot of people in Delhi had, after they looked at 8 or 10 years of data of trade and felt that, it was not necessarily being equitable in between the all related parties.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit, right? I mean, so FTAs contribute a great deal in to exports, right? For 10-12 years, Indian exports have been hovering at around the $300 billion mark, and we have a target of $450 to $500 billion by FY23. How do we ensure this optimal growth number? How can we balance imports and exports, aside from obviously choosing, our trade partners and maybe renegotiating some of these agreements? Is there some element of industrial policy? Is there anything else that goes into this?
So from my perspective, I mean, I have covered Southeast Asia extensively for a long time, and I can generally see the benefit of FTAs as being a driver of good, right? And India too has benefited in bits and parts as far as FTAs are concerned. But then what you really have to be cognizant of when you are, say, going into any kind of a trade agreement is that you need to be cognizant about your own manufacturing, or your own industrial capacity to basically benefit from it. And that's one of the reasons why India did not join RCEP, was because it would not have been the right time. It would have actually led to some further deindustrialization as far as India is concerned, given the market access that countries like China would have been able to get a foothold on within India, right? So, and if we were in a position where, say, we had enough areas, or, enough drivers of growth, where you are willing to basically sacrifice, say, certain industries, because they are not being cost competitive, and you can actually import it, those goods for a lot cheaper from outside. I don't think fundamentally that's a wrong call, because, well, ultimately it's the consumer which is benefiting, right? And in a way, the US has been doing that trade with China for the last 20 years or so, that, they benefited a lot, from very cheap goods coming in from China. And as a result, their consumption capacity went up in the system, right? It did lead to some negative consequences of, say, the manufacturing sector being hollowed out in certain parts. But then ultimately, one could argue that, it's a political call whether you are okay to let your manufacturing sector stagnate, or whether you want cheap consumption, to be a driver, and both have their pros and cons. In case of India specifically, I think it's just a function of, what was being demanded, because even for us, right, if you take a 20-year view, and our exports have actually done really well. From a value perspective, India's exports are probably the third fastest. They've grown at the third fastest rate, after behind China and Vietnam. in the last 20 years. But then the areas in which we have become very good at exporting, right? And I'm talking specifically about goods here. So you look at petrochemicals, you look at gems and jewelry, and maybe you look at pharma and autos to a certain extent. 3 out of 4 of these sectors are fairly import intensive, right? So what you're basically making is the margin on producing these goods, not necessarily the imports are, they have a very large import component to it, right? So you don't necessarily feel that you have gained a lot, whereas that's not the case with services, because, in services, it's purely value addition when you are exporting services, because, the human being is here, the technology is here, and, the profits are also kept here, right? So the benefits or the net producer surplus is not as large on good that India manufactures on, or we are involved with. And so that's the reason why, we have kind of always had a bit of a love-hate relation as far as goods trade is concerned, because we don't necessarily see the full benefit. My counter argument to this point would be that at times you have to take a 15 to 20 year call in terms of getting those supply chains in. And here I think what India is sort of trying to do with the PLIs, what we are trying to do with say specific protections in certain areas that's being offered to the Indian industry, is that we are being fairly cognizant of a starting position, right? That we cannot suddenly one day wake up and expect India to be the biggest, say, fab producer in the world. That's not going to happen. But certainly we can take the call that, okay, in 10 years time, I want India to be one of the biggest electronics manufacturers in the world, just given our own domestic consumption. So how can I get there? And how can I get people to bring their technology to India? Because we frankly don't have that technology. And by doing the PLI scheme, by allowing free import is one way to basically get these people to come in, set up shop, and over time use India, get used to working in India, and then they expand, right? So it's basically an emphasis on top line export growth rather than the value addition argument, which was being used maybe 5-10 years back to justify not emphasizing exports as a way to grow, say, over a long period. And this is a shift in policy, I think, which has come about in the last 5-6 years, which is not a bad call given the state of the world we are seeing right now.
So, Nirav, FTAs impact various facets of the domestic economy as well, right? I mean, so Rahul has just mentioned a few, whether it's demand, consumption, IP, job creation, etc., right? In terms of FTAs itself, we're very skeptical about, let's say, agriculture, some, sectors like that. And then, we could argue that we perhaps missed the bus on, manufacturing electronic goods and so on and so forth. So there are various aspects of the domestic economy that FTAs impact. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So one thing is, we need to see this has to go hand in hand with our own industrial policy. And one is, if you want to encourage a lot of manufacturing within the country, you have to see that what are we consuming first, and the industrial policy has to be catered to what can we do better by making for India itself. India is a fairly large market, and then so one is we have FTAs to get all the inputs of whatever we are consuming cheaply. So that is one part. Second is that where can we make something, or where do we have an edge? Or say, for example, India is Rahul mentioned the few sectors. One was the auto. India is the world's largest motorcycle manufacturer, right? Two-wheeler manufacturer. So can we export out to like other countries, right? If we are consuming a lot of electronics, so why shouldn't those electronics be assembled in India? We felt that we had missed out on the bus, but now with like global supply chains realigning, maybe there's an opportunity. And if you are making so many mobile phones for domestic consumption, can you export some of them out, right? So that is the thing. Second thing is, as Rahul mentioned, that we did not look at it so much for as a growth angle, but there is a huge multiplier effect. So one is, once there is capital investment from either domestic houses or like foreign players, you see slowly, as you keep making things, you keep building up the value chain, right? So first, maybe you're just assembling some phones, then maybe you start making some of the components till you keep making a few more components. Then apart from like some places where you really don't have an edge, maybe certain semiconductors or certain things, or say like certain raw materials which are not available in India, right? So you only import those things, and India has the edge of having very large pool of working age labor. So can we use that to manufacture and spend elsewhere? And then the income generated not only like so provides employment, but there's a second order effect that people who earn will spend more, and then you'll have rise in greater demand for other goods as well as greater demand for domestic services. So like services, apart from like say IT services, etc., or like now remote work is possible, but a lot of other services like restaurants cannot be exported, right? So if there's greater demand, there's maybe somebody's income, somebody's expense becomes someone else's income, right? So I think that's the whole key. This is like priming the pump. You kind of kickstart like a virtuous cycle. So that is one of the important things. So both is whatever we are consuming, can we get it cheaper? Or whatever are raw materials to make and re-export things, can we get those things cheaper and then export it to people where they put less duties on us? So there we have a competitive advantage versus some of the other countries, or in case of India specifically, have lesser handicap versus the other manufacturing countries in Southeast Asia or China.
So let's talk about a couple of FTAs that were signed, right? Earlier this year, Rahul, India signed an FTA with UAE. It was the first of its kind for the government, fairly comprehensive. And, Prime Minister Modi was supposed to fly to UAE, but then, because of Omicron, he couldn't. And still, we went ahead with a virtual event and got this across the line, right? So what do you make of that India-UAE FTA? Right, it's supposed to create about 10 lakh jobs in India, various sectors, textiles, pharmaceuticals, gems and jewelry, plastic products, etc. Right, and tariffs have come down to almost zero for 90% of the exports to the UAE. What do you make of this trade deal?
Yeah, so I mean, UAE is one of our biggest trading partners. I mean, not just on the oil side, but even on the non-oil side, it's one of our largest export markets, not just for our goods, but also for our services, for our people, right? I mean, so there was natural, I would say there were a lot of synergies, which kind of led to this particular trade agreement. I would say it's a far more comprehensive trade agreement than, just to be classified as an FTA, because there's an investment component to it. There is a labor component to it. So, it sort of allows the two countries to basically have a lot more well thought out and strategic involvement into each other's economy. I would say, the most interesting thing is that, okay, the number of goods, as you said, Carrie, are going to be tariff free 90%, but actually oil is not part of that, right? So oil has been kept out of it. And that's mainly because India puts a lot of excise, and import duties on oil. So we cannot really make that as part of the trade agreement. But then certainly, as far as, say, an export destination, right? So food would be a very critical part of it, that India will now get a lot of preferential access as far as its food exports are concerned. Not that it wasn't the case, we were exporting a lot of food to the Middle East before as well, but now, maybe for our dairy sector, for our a lot of processed food, there will be even greater access that will be provided in the market. What it also does, I think, is that it sort of increases the brand value of Indian products, right? Because one of the problems, you could say, is that while our food processing industry, or even in other areas, our manufacturing sector has, improved, but then there is a big gap between what you would call as, say, an export quality, right? So that's still a thing in India where, you would say certain things are export quality and certain things are only made for the domestic audience. I think the idea should be that we bridge the gap, and the more we are exporting, especially the breadth of products that we are exporting tends to increase, you will see the benefits of that spilling over. So what it does is that it basically creates the opportunity for people to say, okay, fine, if my product is being exported and is being consumed quite easily in a place like UAE, right, which is effectively a first world living quality, for all practical purposes, why can't I be exporting it out to Jordan, to say, to Bahrain, to Saudi, and and other markets as well, right? So I think it gives people a sense of that, okay, once you sort of hit that breadth of products, it will lead to more multiplier effects, as Nirav was mentioning. So it was a very natural one. I think I'm particularly excited about the next one, which is in the pipeline, which is a FTA with the GCC countries, right? So basically with the larger Middle Eastern universe. And, from that perspective, it will particularly be very big for India's food markets or food exports, which have already been growing quite fast. And, it could sort of establish India as a very large and very reliable food exporter, right? Because in the past, we have actually been quite unreliable. We tend to come up with all kinds of rules to prevent exports. But if we have long-term commitment in that region, we will see one area of India's exports markets diversifying, which is on the food side. I think it could also eventually be very good for our companies who are involved with construction, etc. They're already quite big in the Middle East, but then it will lead to more multiplier effects, both for the capital and for the labor markets within the country. So overall, an excellent development, I would say, and something that should have been done years ago.
We covered a bit of this on our episode on West Asia, basically India and West Asia relations. Do check it out. Fairly comprehensive. Spoke about security and economic considerations. So Nirav, let's talk about the FTA with Australia. It's perhaps the first one with what you would call a developed country as such, although that phrasing is slightly complicated in a post-COVID world. But there's a larger significance to this, right? Australia is trying to hedge from the whole China supply chains as such. And of course, India, Australia are part of the Quad. What are the gives and the gets in this?
Oh yeah, sure. So what is there is that Australia has taken like a strategic view that can't have China as one sole supplier for a lot of goods. That gives them like a lot of say geopolitical leverage. So they've kind of they've been part of a Quad. On the security side, they bought a lot of US submarines. They're part of AUKUS, right? Instead of buying diesel submarines from France, etc. So now they're worried that China has a lot of leverage on them. Similarly, you can see how Russia has leverage on Europe, right? Because of energy exports. So they want to diversify away. Second thing is, look at Australia and India, very complementary countries. So Australia exports a lot of raw materials, so iron ore, coking coal, thermal coal, etc. Right? Aluminium ore. So they export a lot of natural resources which are found under the ground, and because it's a very rich country with a very small population, they do not like labor intensive manufacturing. Doesn't make sense there. The cost of labor is just too high. So they import all manufactured goods like cars, any manufactured or chemical goods, etc. They're all imported, right? So this is an opportunity for, say, India, that India can export, even if, say, for example, the Hyundai plant or like a Toyota plant in India can export cars, or why not like Tata or Mahindra export their SUVs to Australia, right? So that is one part. Second is also for movement of people. So Australia is a country which is, while like other developed countries, it is aging. It had a policy for young working professionals to be able to come in for a working holiday. See, this earlier was a part of their, what you would call the White Australia policy, where Europeans could come to Australia on a tourist visa, or what they would call a working holiday visa, and do odd jobs or do some jobs in Australia, and then they would eventually probably settle there. So this was a way of attracting educated immigrants. Now Australia feels that India has a lot of cultural similarities. Like a lot of the Indian educated people are English speakers, and because of like cricket or whatever reasons, there's a lot of cultural familiarity with Australia and India. So now Indian professionals also are eligible for this whole working holiday thing. Say Indian medical degrees are also recognized in Australia. So they are seeing that India has a lot of excess labor, right? Which can benefit Australia. So I think this is another FTA which works two ways. Also, here the timing was quite interesting, where Australia is going for elections next month. So the Prime Minister Scott Morrison and his team was they quickly rushed into it. Some things again which are exempt is dairy and like agri goods, which again India doesn't want, because Australia is actually a very big agri exporter. Apart from like base metals or like coal, it's a very big exporter of agricultural goods because last huge amount of land area, right? So, but that is what India doesn't want them to be flooding our markets. If like the marginal cost for them is almost zero, then they can like sell it cheap. So those have been exempt from the FTA. This is an FTA which I feel is mutually beneficial. Our trade is about just $27 billion a year, so it's relatively small. But they aim to grow it to like 50 billion and 100 billion, 50 billion in the next 3 years, 2025, 100 billion by 2030. So I think that's a very fantastic thing where, again, as like Rahul mentioned, if you start seeing the branding for Indian goods could improve a lot. Say once people start seeing that those goods being used in Australia, right? Say, for example, if you see a Tata Safari or a Mahindra XUV being driven on the roads of Australia, so then you will see those demand for those exports pick up, right? Or like made in India, but could be like a Hyundai or a Honda car, right? So even if those are like made or assembled in India. So I think those things will be like a big positive, as well as this has given our Ministry of Commerce and Indian bureaucrats as well as people in the government to learn a bit. There's a bit of learning curve that in negotiating any kind of documents, what are the sticking points, what things can we let go, what things should we stick around, right? And I think these agreements are like a nice template for us to go ahead and sign FTAs with many other countries as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just in our lifetimes, how the Made in China brand has made a complete U-turn, right?
Absolutely.
And all thanks to the likes of Apple and so on. Rahul, this whole restructuring of supply chains post-COVID, right? I mean, that's like a definite tailwind which is in favor of India, right? I mean, a lot of the countries globally are, trying to move away from the whole China supply chain ecosystem. And that could benefit India immensely. So in that sense, the next couple of years or few years, the way we kind of position ourselves and act quickly to form agreements will be really, really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a fair thing to say. I would say theoretically, yes, India should be a very large beneficiary of any shift away from China or a China plus one strategy. But then it also partly is incumbent on us to make sure that we have the right set of industrial policies and the bottom up environment as far as say operational capacity is concerned is being done correctly. So I think there is a fair amount of positive movement I personally see as far as certain states are concerned, right? So if you look at, say, the industrial environment that's prevailing in places like Karnataka or Tamil Nadu, UP incrementally, Haryana, Gujarat, these are the states which appear the best place to kind of, benefit from some of these relocations. And, in the past, we have seen similar dynamic play out. So the reason why India has become, a reasonably large exporter of automobiles is not because we were doing something very right. There was the flooding issue, and you had the earthquakes in Japan, you had the flooding in Thailand, and it basically required a lot of the Japanese auto producers to have another country which they could use as a base for manufacturing, right? So you need a level of serendipity, you need some amount of strategic planning, and then you also need a fair amount of execution skills. So it's not the easiest thing, right? If it was, then a lot of other countries would have been in position of strength as far as developing a manufacturing sector which is towards export is concerned. But it's a very hard thing to do, right? What I do see as a positive development is that we have probably a reasonably good assessment of our key strengths and our weaknesses. And so if we can be aware of that and we can accordingly position ourselves, we should be in a position to benefit at least a bit, if not in a very large way, at least at the margin we will end up net positive from that transition that comes about. I think one of the good things that's going for India in the current environment, I think, is that we have a sense that despite whatever has happened, say in the last couple of years, the strategic direction or the broad direction for the Indian economy has not shifted very materially, right? What has effectively happened is that the timelines around economic size has been pushed out. So instead of hitting $5 trillion economy by 23-24, we will probably get there by 25-26 or 26-27. We will still be a reasonably we'll be like the third biggest economy in the world, maybe by the end of this decade. So that economic size itself should allow us to become better at manufacturing a few things, right? Because our industrial policies have corrected to a point where it is imperative for a lot of companies to come make in India because it's just uneconomical to do so. Just purely from a taxation and from a trade perspective. So I think we will benefit from a lot of these factors, but I still don't think I would necessarily say that this will be the biggest driver of growth in India, right? I think the biggest driver of activity in India will remain the domestic consumption cycle, which is to a large extent fulfilled by domestic services or domestic goods manufacturing. Exports can just become like an additive area, right? And this is where whatever little we can get, whether it's 50 basis points or 100 basis points of additional growth, through the export channel, I think that's good enough for us, as long as it's not cutting away into our domestic activity is good enough, I think. So that shift in the focus area or in the balance, I think is a positive development, and we just need to ensure that that sticks, whether it's through FTAs or through direct innovation, whichever way we can do it.
Nirav, what are some future FTAs that we can expect in the pipeline? What countries would you say we should have agreements with, and why?
So one is being spoken about right now. So one is with the UK, though like right now due to the Ukraine war, etc., there's a lot of backlash even with like Rishi Sunak. But UK got out of the EU and it is looking to re-engage with the Commonwealth, right? You had Conservative Friends of the Commonwealth also having a joint venture with Bharat Varta. So they are looking to re-engage. So I think that one is another obvious one. There are old links. There is a lot of people movement. There are a lot of people of Indian origin in UK. There are a lot of Indian citizens as well. So not just like British citizens, but a lot of Indian citizens who are working in United Kingdom. So I think that one is one which is there in the pipeline. Then as Rahul mentioned, free trade agreement with all the GCC countries. So like that's Saudi Arabia, Oman, Bahrain, Qatar. So those ones. And there's another free trade agreement with Israel. So they're calling it the Indo-Abrahamic corridor. So this, because you look at like countries like UAE or Qatar, they're very big trading hubs. So they can import from India and then re-export somewhere else. And this corridor is like a land bridge connecting, you can say, to Europe as well, right? So that is one. There is one also being talked about or somewhere further behind in the pipeline, which is with the EU. But that I think would be a little more difficult. Maybe Rahul can elaborate more on that. I think EU is when you're negotiating, there are like multiple countries, a lot of issues are there, and India may not accede to all their requests. Also, with currently India kind of abstaining to vote, India has not taken any side on the Russia-Ukraine issue, might not fly that well. So that's also another thing. But what I would say is, what has COVID taught us? So specifically is you had from the 1980s onwards, where this kind of free trade and more globalization happened, you went in for high efficiency, a single supplier, economy of scale, everything is just in time production, right? That you carry very low inventory, just in time, and you focused everything on efficiency with very less redundancy. So that is where like probably India lost out to like East Asian countries, right? They had like economies of scale and all of that. Now what has happened is, you don't want just in time, you want just in case. What if somewhere there's an issue? What if there is either COVID or an earthquake or some floods or any natural disaster? What if a government changes somewhere and they change their policies towards you, right? You are going from focusing on efficiency to focusing on resilience. You're going from focusing on just in time to like just in case, just have some inventory just in case, right? And you will see like multiple parallel supply chains coming up. So I think there, you look at the world where with such a large population and still a large working age population. So I think India is one of the countries. So obviously, it's not as if whatever China loses out, India is the only one to gain. There are countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, all of them, right? So this is an opportunity. And if you have a better trade agreement, or like sometimes we are already starting from a little bit behind. So we are trying to catch up. So I think that is another thing. So these are the ones which I see, which are there in the pipeline. Ones like RCEP, so RCEP, with a lot of the East Asian countries, or like earlier, which were like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Those ones I would say wouldn't work out that much because they're all net trade surplus countries. India is like a trade deficit country. India recently exported about $418 billion worth of goods, but our imports are $650 billion, right? So we still run a substantial trade deficit. And this is a way of like trying and boosting and maybe reaching to like a neutral trade balance.
Rahul, any final thoughts on what we need to make FTA successful? Anything on the domestic economy front, industrial policy front that can really complement all of these efforts on the foreign policy and the trade agreements to make it so much better?
Yeah, so I always
that could be an episode by itself, but
yeah, but I just got reminded of a joke that a friend of mine who used to negotiate. He was involved with one of the trade agreements that India was negotiating, and he always used to joke that the Indians take a very long time to actually agree to a trade agreement, but they also implement everything in a very short time. So you're basically not front loading the benefits, and you're actually giving up your whatever little gains you have had very quickly. And so we effectively need to flip the entire model, right? Where we actually agree to open up trade very quickly, but then, we, depending on how we are benefiting or not benefiting, we should accordingly engineer opening our markets as well, right? Because India, as Neera was saying, India is always going to remain a very big market. And since we are starting from a position of a large trade deficit, obviously we consume more than we export, right? So from that perspective, there is a certain amount of market leverage that India holds, that we should be utilizing that as a way to, entice other countries to also open up their markets to us, right? So from that standpoint, I think, it ultimately comes down to, like, the old adage is that, if you don't have commodity resources, like India is not a big commodity exporter, right? I mean, okay, now we are exporting food, etc., but it takes time to grow that. Like, it's not something, that's you just dig it out of the ground and export it out. So there is an opportunity here, but then, we also have to, uh, you know, domestically we have to get it right, right? Without that, you are not necessarily going to get the advantages of just signing these agreements. And they, just because we have signed a free trade agreement doesn't mean our trade is going to increase. It can increase, but it might increase in the wrong direction. So you have to be fairly cognizant of of these things. But then it is, without competing, or without actually playing at the global stage, you can't then complain that, well, you're not getting, your exports are not growing. Because frankly, if you can't compete with a better quality product which is being produced at a cheaper cost, then there's fundamentally something wrong with us, not because somebody is doing it, or they are not playing it fairly. So in that sense, I mean, I'm personally happy to see that India is engaging, whether it is through FTAs or through bilateral deals, or through just company to company thing. We just have to ensure that our private sector gets as much runway to manufacture and to compete at a global level, because I think we can do it. There's no reason we can't do it. But most often than not, it's actually the top down policies which tend to create problems, right? I mean, so I just think, if we are cognizant of our shortcomings, we work on fixing them, India's exports can easily double in the next 5 to 7 years. There's no reason we can't do that, as we have seen in the last in previous episodes, where we do see whenever global demand improves, our exports actually tend to do quite well.
So just adding to this point, right? So two things is, we had, so one set of one big shift actually, while the big reform they say is 1991, but like a lot of those reforms that started in the early 80s. So that was I would call say reforms 1.0, right? Where you can say when Maruti Suzuki was set up, or when Hero Honda was set up, right? That's early 80s. So that was since then, and then 1991 a little bit faster, but that was one set of reforms. So what India has done well, so apart from the FTA, just for our domestic thing, is the production linked incentives. So you've seen that there's been a 30-40 year experience of opening up the economy. We've seen wherever sometimes we saw a bit of deindustrialization or products where we couldn't compete, so they've gone out, and we've seen that what are we consuming more of? So where are the gaps? So I think the production linked incentives is quite a good policy. Obviously, if the policy is good, now the execution also needs to be done well. But that is one thing which kickstarts Indian manufacturing industry, right? So if our manufacturing industry is strong enough, then you have something to sell to someone else. Because if you kind of say you opened, you can say that you widened the doors, right? You widened the doors or widened the pipes for goods to flow through on both directions. So as Rahul mentioned, what happened is when we widened it, our imports grew faster, but our exports didn't grow enough, right? So we need to fix our domestic industrial policy well first. And the PLI schemes are doing that, right? So hopefully if these two in conjunction, that you are manufacturing a lot more, and then you can export because you are an efficient producer and a good quality producer, then you have something to sell elsewhere. So that's the first part. Second one is, I think India, if you look at how the other parts of the world have grown, they did agricultural reforms first, then they did manufacturing reforms, and then last one was services, right? India's kind of the services has been the leader, and then now we're doing manufacturing, and then last is agriculture. So this is one of my pet peeves. So yes, we had like the whole period of food shortages pre-green revolution, and a large chunk of our population is dependent on agriculture. But we do need reforms there. So for where does the industry have like a lack of so we have kind of cross subsidized agriculture from industry. So agri loans are subsidized, so industry has to pay more for credit. Agri electricity subsidized, so industry pays more for electricity. Labor for agriculture, you have the NREGA scheme, so rural people who do not have jobs do not need to leave or try to join like manufacturing jobs because agricultural labor is subsidized. So what has happened is all these policies, they all need to move in conjunction. See, there is also politics involved. So obviously there is a political element as well, because you can do a lot of reforms, but if people don't like it or if the society is not ready for it, then they can be derailed, right? So the other one is that once we kind of slowly get out of, we can do some amount of agricultural reforms, that frees up resources which will help our manufacturing base. So I think that is also probably the next step. I think politically might be too difficult, but sometime in the future, this can add like tailwinds as like the momentum picks up. I think that is another thing which can help us to export more, and then this provides as an exports as a channel for growth for India.
Absolutely. Rahul, any final thoughts, or we could end the podcast?
No, I mean, let's just wait and see for 2-3 years as to how these FTAs play out. Hopefully, we will continue the momentum.
All right. That's an optimistic note to end the podcast on. Thank you, Nirav. Thank you, Rahul, for being on Bharat Varta and shedding light on, something which is really important for us from an economic standpoint. So thank you again. And thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll see you on another episode of Bharat Varta. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Bharat Varta podcast. If you want to see more content like this, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We started Bharat Varta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you wish to offer us feedback, do reach out to us on social media. We are at Bharat Varta on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You could also get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvarta.in. The links are in the description below. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.